Part 1. The Perfect Life That Wasn't Perfect. David Parker was 38 years old and seemed to have the perfect life. He had a beautiful house, a successful career, a loving wife, and an 8-year-old daughter. To everyone around him, he looked like a man who had achieved everything. No one knew that something inside him was slowly beginning to change. Every morning followed the same routine. David woke up at 6, put on his suit, adjusted his tie, and prepared for another day at work. He looked into the mirror and wondered why he no longer felt excited about life. Everything felt predictable, and every day looked exactly like the one before. Downstairs, the smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen. Emily, his wife, was cooking breakfast while Sophie laughed as she watched cartoons before school. The house was full of warmth, but David's mind seemed far away. "Good morning," Emily said with a smile as she placed a plate of eggs and toast on the table. "I made your favorite breakfast." David smiled politely. "Thank you. It looks delicious." They ate together as a family, just like they always did. Emily talked about her plans for the day, while Sophie happily shared stories about school. David listened quietly, answering only when someone spoke directly to him. Emily noticed his silence. "You've been very quiet lately," she said gently. "I'm just tired," David replied. "You've been saying that almost every day." David looked down at his coffee. "Work has been stressful lately." Emily wanted to believe him, but something didn't feel right. The man sitting across from her wasn't the same husband she had married years ago. His body was there, but his thoughts seemed somewhere else. Before leaving for work, Sophie ran toward him and hugged him tightly. "Daddy, don't forget my school play tomorrow." David smiled and kissed her forehead. "I promise I'll be there." Sophie looked at him for a second before smiling. "You promised last time too." Her innocent words stayed in David's mind as he walked toward his car. The drive to work was slow because of heavy traffic. As he watched hundreds of people rushing to their offices, he couldn't stop thinking about his own life. He had everything he once dreamed of, yet he couldn't explain why he felt empty. When David arrived at the office, the building was already busy. Employees greeted each other. Phones rang constantly, and computers lit up every desk. It looked like every other Monday morning. Around 10 o'clock, everyone gathered in the meeting room. The department manager smiled. "We have someone new joining our team today." The door opened, and a woman walked into the room. She introduced herself confidently. "Hello, everyone. My name is Olivia Brooks. It's a pleasure to meet you all." David looked up for only a moment. She was professional, calm, and confident. Their eyes met briefly. She smiled politely, and David smiled back before looking away. The meeting continued as usual. New projects were discussed, deadlines were assigned, and everyone returned to work. David tried to focus, but he found himself remembering Olivia's face more often than he expected. Later that afternoon, David walked into the office kitchen to make a cup of coffee. As he waited for the machine, Olivia entered the room carrying an empty mug. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. "Of course not," David replied. She poured herself a coffee and stood beside him. "I've heard you're one of the best marketing managers here." David laughed softly. "I think people give me too much credit." They talked for only a few minutes about work, the company, and the city. It was a normal conversation between two co-workers. Nothing unusual happened, but somehow David kept thinking about it long after they returned to their desks. That evening, David arrived home to find Emily preparing his favorite pasta for dinner. Sophie excitedly showed him a drawing she had made at school. They smiled at him, hoping to share another happy evening together. Throughout dinner, Emily talked about Sophie's school performance the next day. Sophie couldn't stop talking about the costumes she would wear on stage. David nodded from time to time, but his thoughts kept drifting back to work. Emily finally put down her fork. "David, are you even listening?" He looked up, surprised. "I'm sorry. You've been somewhere else all evening." David forced a smile. "I've just been thinking about tomorrow's presentation." Emily reached across the table and gently held his hand. She wanted to believe his explanation, but deep inside she felt something was changing. She just didn't know what. David squeezed her hand and smiled. "I love you." Emily smiled back. "So do I." But as David looked into her eyes, A strange feeling filled his heart. For the first time in many years, he wasn't sure whether he was lying to her or lying to himself. Part 2. A dangerous friendship. The next morning, David woke up earlier than usual. He got dressed quietly and left the house before Emily and Sophie finished breakfast. He told himself he simply wanted to avoid the morning traffic, but that wasn't the whole truth. When he arrived at the office, Olivia was already there. She was sitting alone with a laptop and a cup of coffee, reviewing documents for an upcoming project. She looked up as David walked past. "Good morning," she said with a friendly smile. "Morning," David replied. He smiled back before entering his office. Later that day, the department manager announced a new marketing campaign. It was one of the company's biggest projects of the year, and everyone expected fierce competition for the lead position. To David's surprise, the manager assigned Olivia to work directly with him. "I believe the two of you will make a great team," the manager said. David nodded politely. Olivia smiled. "I can't wait to get started." For the next few days, they spent hours together discussing ideas, analyzing market research, and preparing presentations. They often stayed in the conference room long after everyone else had gone home. Their conversations slowly changed. At first, they only talked about work. Then they began talking about movies, music, and travel. Soon they were sharing stories about their lives. One afternoon, Olivia looked out the office window and sighed. "Sometimes I wonder if life is supposed to feel this repetitive." David looked at her. "What do you mean?" She smiled sadly. "Wake up, work, go home, sleep, then do it all again." David felt an uncomfortable feeling in his chest. "I've had that same thought." Olivia looked surprised. "I thought I was the only one." For the first time in months, David felt that someone truly understood him. He didn't realize how dangerous that feeling could become. Every lunch break, they sat together in the company cafeteria. Co-workers began noticing how often they laughed together. Some joked about their friendship, but neither David nor Olivia paid much attention. One evening, after finishing another long meeting, heavy rain began pouring outside. Olivia looked through the glass doors. "I forgot my umbrella." David held up his car keys. "I can give you a ride if you'd like." She hesitated for a moment. "Are you sure? I don't want to inconvenience you. It's on my way." She smiled. "Thank you." During the drive, rain tapped softly against the windshield. Music played quietly through the speakers, and the city lights reflected on the wet roads. The peaceful silence felt strangely comfortable. They talked about childhood memories, favorite books, and dreams they had never achieved. David found himself laughing more than he had in a long time. When they arrived at Olivia's apartment, she turned toward him. "Thanks for the ride." "My pleasure. I'm glad we're working together." "So am I." She stepped out of the car and disappeared into the building. David sat there for another minute before driving home. When he finally arrived, the house was dark except for the living room. Emily was sitting on the couch, waiting for him. "You missed Sophie's school play," she said quietly. David's heart dropped. He had completely forgotten. He looked at the clock. It was almost 10 o'clock. Emily's eyes filled with disappointment. "She kept looking for you." David couldn't find the right words. I'm sorry." Upstairs, Sophie had already fallen asleep, still wearing her little costume. Part 3. The first lie. David barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he remembered Sophie's disappointed face. His promise had been broken once again, and this time there was no excuse that could erase the pain. The next morning, the house was unusually quiet. Emily prepared breakfast without saying much, while Sophie avoided looking at her father. The cheerful little girl who usually hugged him before work remained silent. David finally spoke. "Sophie, I'm really sorry." She looked down at her cereal. "It's okay." Those two words hurt David more than if she had cried. He knew she wasn't okay. She had simply stopped expecting him to keep his promises. Before leaving for school, Sophie picked up her backpack. "I'll see you later, Dad." She smiled politely, but it wasn't the happy smile he knew. After they left, Emily turned toward David. "This can't keep happening." David sighed. "I know. You always say work is important." Emily's voice trembled. "But your family needs you too." David wanted to explain. He wanted to promise that things would change. Instead, he simply nodded and left for work. At the office, Olivia noticed he looked exhausted. "You don't seem like yourself today." David forced a smile. "I didn't sleep very well." She handed him a cup of coffee. "Long night?" "You could say that." For a moment, David considered telling her everything. How he had forgotten Sophie's performance. How guilty he felt. How disappointed Emily had been. Instead, he changed the subject. They spent the afternoon preparing for an important client presentation. Their teamwork impressed everyone in the meeting room. The presentation was a huge success, and the client immediately accepted their proposal. The office erupted into applause. "Great job," the manager said. "You two make an incredible team." Everyone congratulated David and Olivia. Later that evening, several co-workers suggested celebrating at a nearby restaurant. "You both have to come," one of them insisted. David hesitated. He had promised Emily he would come home early. "I don't know." Olivia smiled. "It's just dinner. You've earned it." David took out his phone. He stared at Emily's name on the screen. Then he typed a message. "I'm sorry. An important client meeting is taking longer than expected. I'll be home late." He pressed send. A few seconds later, Emily replied, "Okay. Drive safely. Sophie and I will wait for you." David looked at the message. A strange feeling settled in his chest. It was the first lie he had ever told his wife. At the restaurant, everyone laughed, shared stories, and celebrated the successful project. As the night went on, one coworker after another left. Soon, only David and Olivia remained. Neither of them seemed in a hurry to go home. They talked for hours, not about work, but about life, about dreams, about regrets. For the first time, David admitted something he had never told anyone. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life." Olivia looked into his eyes. "Maybe you're just searching for the person you used to be." Her words stayed with him. When they finally walked outside, the streets were almost empty. The cool night air surrounded them. Neither of them noticed that one small lie had opened the door to many more. Part 4. Crossing the line. The weeks passed quickly, and David found himself spending more and more time with Olivia. Every new project seemed to bring them closer together. What had started as a professional partnership was slowly becoming something much more personal. They exchanged messages during lunch, then after work. Soon they were texting each other late at night. At first, the conversations were innocent. They talked about books, music, and funny moments at the office. But little by little, the messages became more personal. They began sharing feelings they had never shared with anyone else. One evening, Emily noticed David smiling while looking at his phone. "What's so funny?" she asked. David quickly locked the screen. "Oh, just a joke from someone at work." Emily nodded, but something about his reaction didn't feel natural. For the first time, she felt a small seed of doubt growing inside her heart. A few days later, David and Olivia traveled together to another city for a business meeting. They spent the entire day presenting ideas to an important client. By the evening, the meeting had been a complete success. "We should celebrate," Olivia said with a smile. "There's a nice cafe across the street." David hesitated for a second. Then he agreed. The cafe overlooked a quiet river. Soft music played in the background. The lights reflected beautifully on the water. For a while, neither of them spoke. Olivia finally broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" David nodded. "Of course. Are you happy?" The question caught him completely off guard. He looked out the window before answering. "I don't know anymore." Olivia lowered her eyes. "I understand. I've spent years pretending everything is fine." David looked at her. For the first time, he realized they weren't just sharing conversations anymore. They were sharing emotional burdens. As they walked back toward the hotel, rain suddenly began to fall. They ran together, laughing as they tried to stay dry. When they reached the entrance, both of them were soaked. Olivia brushed the wet hair away from her face. David couldn't stop looking at her. Their eyes met. Neither of them said a word. For a brief moment, it felt as though the rest of the world had disappeared. Then Olivia quietly stepped closer. David knew exactly what was happening. He also knew he should walk away. He thought about Emily. He thought about Sophie. He thought about the promises he had made. But instead of taking one step backward, he stayed where he was. A single moment of weakness changed everything. David gently kissed Olivia. It lasted only a few seconds, but those few seconds destroyed a line that should never have been crossed. When they finally stepped apart, neither of them smiled. They both understood that nothing would ever be the same again. Back at home, Emily was helping Sophie finish her homework. She looked at the family photo on the living room shelf. Without knowing why, she suddenly felt afraid that her family was beginning to fall apart. Part 5. Secrets become habits. After the kiss, David and Olivia promised each other that it would never happen again. They both agreed it had been a mistake, caused by emotion and exhaustion. Deep inside, however, neither of them truly believed those words. The following Monday, they met again at the office. For a brief moment, they acted like strangers, but pretending was harder than they expected. Every glance carried unspoken feelings. Every conversation felt different. The distance they tried to create slowly disappeared. Within days, they were eating lunch together again. Soon, they began leaving the office at the same time. Sometimes they met at a quiet cafe. Other times, they simply drove around the city, talking for hours. David kept telling himself they were just talking, but he knew the truth. He was living a second life. One evening, Olivia looked at him and asked, "Do you ever feel guilty?" David remained silent for several seconds. "Every single day." "Then why don't we stop?" He stared through the windshield. "Because every time I try, I miss you." Neither of them spoke after that. The silence said more than words ever could. At home, Emily noticed small changes. David always carried his phone with him. He never left it on the table anymore. Even when taking a shower, the phone stayed nearby. One night, his phone vibrated while he was in the bathroom. The screen lit up on the kitchen counter. Emily wasn't trying to spy. She only wanted to move the phone closer to him. As she reached for it, a message appeared on the screen. "I can't stop thinking about tonight." There was no name, only an unsaved number. Emily froze. Her heartbeat became faster. Before she could read anything else, David rushed out of the bathroom. He quickly picked up the phone. "Who was it?" Emily asked calmly. David didn't hesitate. "Just a client." Emily looked into his eyes. For the first time in their marriage, she wasn't sure she believed him. That night, while David slept, Emily lay awake beside him. Questions filled her mind. Why had he hidden his phone? Why did he suddenly work so many late nights? Why did every explanation sound rehearsed? Across the city, Olivia couldn't sleep either. She stared at her own phone. She knew David belonged to another family. She knew someone else would suffer if this continued. Yet every time she tried to walk away, her heart pulled her back. The secret that had begun with one innocent conversation had now become a habit. And habits are often much harder to break than promises. Part 6. The truth begins to surface. Emily could no longer ignore the feeling in her heart. Every late-night meeting, every hidden phone call, and every excuse David made seemed to point to the same painful conclusion. She didn't want to believe it, but the signs were becoming impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Emily visited David's office to surprise him with lunch. She smiled as she carried his favorite meal through the front entrance, hoping they could spend a little time together. When she reached the reception desk, the receptionist smiled politely. "Mr. Parker left about 30 minutes ago." Emily frowned. "He told me he had meetings all afternoon." The receptionist checked the schedule. "He did, but the meetings were cancelled." Emily thanked her and quietly walked back to her car. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel. If David wasn't at work, where was he? At that very moment, David was sitting in a quiet restaurant across town with Olivia. Neither of them noticed how much time had passed. They laughed, shared stories, and forgot about everything waiting for them at home. Olivia looked at him. "Do you ever wish we had met years ago?" David hesitated. "Sometimes." She smiled sadly. "Me too." Those words made David's heart race. For the first time, he realized this was no longer just an affair. Feelings had become real. Meanwhile, Emily sat alone inside her car. She remembered every strange moment from the past few months. The missed school play, the late-night messages, the hidden phone, the constant business trips. One by one, the pieces began fitting together. That evening, David finally arrived home. Emily greeted him with a calm smile. "How was your meeting?" David answered without hesitation. "It went well." Emily looked directly into his eyes. Really? He nodded. It lasted all afternoon. Emily quietly placed a restaurant receipt on the dining table. She had found it inside the pocket of David's jacket while putting his clothes into the washing machine. The receipt showed 2 meals, 2 desserts, 2 cups of coffee, purchased at the exact time David claimed to be in a meeting. David's face turned pale. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Emily finally broke the silence. Who were you with? David opened his mouth, but no words came out. It was the first time his lies had caught up with him, and deep inside, he knew the truth could no longer stay hidden forever. Part 7. The confession. The room fell completely silent. David stared at the restaurant receipt lying on the table, while Emily waited for an answer. Neither of them moved, and even the ticking clock on the wall seemed louder than ever. Emily spoke first. I'm asking you one more time. Who were you with? David took a deep breath. It was a coworker. Emily looked at him without blinking. A man or a woman? David lowered his head. A woman. Emily closed her eyes for a moment. She had hoped he would deny everything. Instead, her worst fear had just become reality. Tears slowly filled her eyes. How long has this been going on? David remained silent. The silence itself became the answer. Emily's voice trembled. Months? David quietly nodded. Emily stepped backward as if she had been struck. I trusted you. I believed every late meeting. I defended you whenever people said you worked too much. David felt ashamed. I'm so sorry. Emily shook her head. No, you're sorry because I found out. Not because you did it. Those words pierced David's heart. He couldn't argue, because she was right. At that moment, little footsteps echoed from the hallway. Sophie stood at the entrance to the kitchen. She looked from her father to her mother. Mom, why are you crying? Emily quickly wiped away her tears. It's nothing, sweetheart. But children often understand more than adults realize. Sophie slowly walked toward her father. Dad, did you make Mom cry? David felt his chest tighten. He knelt in front of his daughter. I'm sorry. Sophie looked confused. You promised we would always be a happy family. David couldn't hold back his tears anymore. He hugged Sophie tightly. She hugged him back. But something had changed. The feeling of safety, the feeling of trust, was beginning to disappear. That night, Emily packed a small suitcase. She folded Sophie's clothes carefully and placed them inside. David stood in the bedroom doorway. Please don't leave. Emily didn't stop packing. I need time. I don't even know who you are anymore. David stepped closer. I'll end it. I'll do anything. Emily finally looked at him. If you really loved us, you would never have started it. An hour later, Emily and Sophie walked out the front door. David stood alone in the empty house. He watched their car disappear into the darkness. For the first time since the affair began, he realized what it had truly cost him, and he feared it might already be too late to fix. Part 8. Losing everything. David sat alone in the silent house. The laughter that once filled every room had disappeared. The family photos on the walls now reminded him of everything he had taken for granted. For the first time in years, there was no one waiting for him at dinner. No one asked how his day had been. No little footsteps ran toward him when he opened the front door. The house felt cold, not because of the weather, but because love had left with Emily and Sophie. The next morning, David woke up to complete silence. He looked at the empty side of the bed. Emily's pillow was gone. So was Sophie's favorite stuffed bear. Only then did the reality truly sink in. He picked up his phone and called Emily. No answer. He sent a message. Please let me explain. The message was delivered, but it was never answered. At work, David struggled to concentrate. His presentation was filled with mistakes. He forgot important details. His co-workers noticed something was wrong. Even Olivia could see the pain on his face. During lunch, she quietly approached him. Did you tell her? David nodded. She knows everything. Olivia looked down at the floor. I'm sorry. David sighed deeply. So am I. For the first time since they had met, there was an uncomfortable distance between them. The excitement that had once brought them together had disappeared. In its place, there was only guilt. A few days later, Olivia asked to meet him after work. They sat on a quiet park bench as the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Finally, Olivia broke the silence. This has to end. David looked at her. I know. We've hurt too many people. David nodded slowly. I thought being with you would make me happier. Olivia smiled sadly. I thought the same, but all we've done is make everyone miserable. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I never wanted to destroy a family. David lowered his head. Neither did I. They sat together one last time. No arguments, no promises, no excuses. Just two people facing the consequences of their choices. When they stood up, Olivia gave him a gentle hug. I hope one day you earn your family's forgiveness. David watched her walk away. He didn't try to stop her. He knew this goodbye was necessary. That evening, he drove to Emily's parents' house. He remained inside the car for several minutes, gathering the courage to knock on the door. When Emily finally opened it, she looked surprised. David's eyes were red from crying. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted to say, I'm truly sorry. Emily remained silent. Then Sophie appeared behind her mother. She looked at her father with tears in her eyes. Daddy, when are you coming home? David couldn't answer, because the home he once had was already falling apart. Part 9. A long road to forgiveness. David couldn't answer Sophie's question. Instead, he knelt down and hugged his daughter as tears filled his eyes. For the first time, he truly understood that his choices had not only hurt his wife, they had also broken his little girl's heart. I'm so sorry, sweetheart, he whispered. Sophie hugged him tightly. I miss you, Dad. David closed his eyes. I miss you too. Emily watched him quietly from the doorway. Seeing Sophie cry made her heart ache. Despite everything David had done, he was still Sophie's father. After a few minutes, Emily gently called Sophie inside. It's getting late. Sophie looked at her father one last time. Will you come back? David forced a small smile. I hope so. He walked back to his car with a heavy heart. For the first time in months, he stopped blaming work, stress, or anyone else. He accepted that every decision had been his own. The following weeks were the hardest of his life. Emily refused to return home. She answered only a few of his messages. Most of them were left unread. David respected her decision. Instead of making excuses, he began changing himself. He started seeing a marriage counselor on his own. He worked fewer hours. He stopped staying late at the office. Most importantly, he ended all contact with Olivia. He deleted her phone number. He blocked her messages. He even requested a transfer to another department. He knew rebuilding trust would require more than words. It would require actions. Every Saturday, he visited Sophie with Emily's permission. They went to the park together. They rode bicycles. They fed ducks by the lake. Little by little, Sophie began smiling again. One afternoon, she looked at her father and asked, Are you still going to break your promises? David shook his head. No, I've already broken too many. Months passed. David never asked Emily to forgive him. He simply tried to become a better man. He believed forgiveness was a gift, not something he could demand. One evening, Emily called him unexpectedly. There will be a school concert next Friday. David's heart raced. I'll be there. Emily paused for a moment. I know. It was the first time in a long while. She believed his words, but rebuilding a marriage would be much harder than keeping one promise. Part 10. Some scars never fade. Friday evening finally arrived. David sat quietly in the front row of the school auditorium. His hands were shaking as he waited for the performance to begin. This time, he had arrived almost an hour early because he never wanted to disappoint Sophie again. When the curtain opened, Sophie walked onto the stage. She searched the audience. The moment she saw her father smiling at her, her face lit up with joy. David waved gently. Tears filled his eyes. He had kept his promise. After the performance, Sophie ran into his arms. You came! David hugged her tightly. I told you I would. Sophie smiled. I knew you wouldn't forget this time. Those simple words meant more to David than any promotion or award he had ever received. Months passed. David continued working hard to rebuild his life. He remained faithful to his promises. He spent every possible weekend with Sophie. He treated Emily with patience and respect, never asking for more than she was willing to give. Slowly, Emily began to see the changes. David no longer hid his phone. He came home on time. He was honest, even when the truth was difficult. One afternoon, they sat together in a quiet cafe. For the first time in many months, they talked without anger, without shouting, without blaming each other. Emily looked at him. I can see you've changed. David nodded. I had to. I almost lost the most important people in my life. Emily took a deep breath. I forgive you. David looked up, surprised. But forgiveness doesn't erase the pain. He lowered his head. I know. Some memories will always hurt. Emily smiled sadly. Trust is like a mirror. You can repair it after it's broken, but you'll always see the cracks. David accepted her words. He knew that forgiveness was not the same as forgetting. From that day forward, they decided to start over. Not because everything had been fixed, but because both of them were willing to try. Years later, Sophie graduated from high school. As she stood on the stage to receive her diploma, she looked toward her parents. This time, both of them were there, sitting side by side, smiling proudly. On the drive home, Sophie looked at her father. Dad? Yes? What's the most important lesson you've ever learned? David smiled softly before answering. Never trade a lifetime of love for a moment of temptation. He glanced at Emily. She gently squeezed his hand. Neither of them spoke again. They didn't need to, because they had learned that trust takes years to build, seconds to break, and sometimes an entire lifetime to rebuild. Moral of the story: true love is not about finding someone new when life becomes difficult. It is about choosing the person you once promised to love, even when temptation appears. A single wrong decision can destroy years of happiness, but honesty, responsibility, and genuine change can become the first steps toward healing.